the Buddha's wife. She comes to us as Yasadhara, and so I'm going to tell you what is known about her and what her story means to me. I think that all of us are familiar pretty much with the Buddha's story, but I'm just going to do a quick thumbnail recap of the Buddha's story. He's born Siddhartha Gautama, a prince, a handsome prince, son of a wealthy and powerful king. He's raised in a paradise with everything he could want, and he lives a life of pleasure and happiness until one day he ventures outside the palace grounds with his servant Chana, and he encounters an old person, a sick person, a corpse, and a mendicant. That's a religious beggar. He's never seen suffering before, and he's so shocked by these sights that he can't get right with it. And eventually he has to leave his home, his wife, and their newborn son on a quest to discover the truth about suffering. He has a lot of adventures, suffers a lot of trials, and finally plants himself under the fig tree, and he vows not to leave until he understands the nature of suffering. He has some further epic trials under the tree until, as the sun rose on the morning of the 50th day, he experiences Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi, complete, perfect enlightenment. And he returns home to teach the world what he has learned, that dukkha is part of life, the causes of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the Eightfold Path. So that's the elevator version of the Buddhist story. It's much richer than that. It's a beautiful, rich story filled with meaning. And it's a familiar story, one that has come to be called the hero's journey. A young man leads his ordinary life, enjoying his pleasures and hanging out with his friends until one day he gets a message. Help, reads the message. Come now, only you can help. He puts the message in his pocket and he tries to forget about it, but it has been prophesied. And anyway, he's a young, healthy man, and he has received a call to adventure. So off he goes, leaving the comforts of his home and family, down the road into the unknown, his knapsack on his back. The road gets more and more challenging as he approaches his goal until he reaches his final epic battle. And after successfully navigating this final test and achieving his prize, our hero, realizing he can never be truly happy while others suffer, returns with his gift to share with the world. This story is deeply resonant for many of us around the world, and it resonates because it's an archetypal story, one that springs from deep within our collective unconscious. That said, the hero's story is a boy's story, told in the language of patriarchal cultures. Yes, it has universal elements. If it didn't, it would not resonate so deeply with us. Still, the heroes are boys. Huck Finn, Bilbo Baggins, Ulysses, Luke Skywalker, all the young knights in search of the Holy Grail. And of course, we can find examples of female heroes who fit this narrative, but they are rare. So, as much as I really love this story, I have to tell you that I've always tripped over the part where he leaves his wife and baby. Now, I'm not judging him, and it wouldn't matter if I did. It's his story. And his renunciation and his home departure are really critical parts of his story. But what about her? His renunciation is her abandonment. So it just has always seemed to me that we're leaving out a pretty big part of the story. What was her experience to be left with a newborn baby the very day he was born? If we shift the spotlight from the departing hero to the one who stays behind, a new story emerges. Yasadhara's story, though rarely told, maybe is less of an action drama, but just as compelling and transformative. So this is a little bit of her story as it has come to us across 100 generations, which is a pretty long time to carry a story. Her name is Yasadhara. She is born on the same day as Siddhartha, and they're first cousins. Her mother is the sister of Siddhartha's father, and her father is the brother of Siddhartha's mother, Maya. I got that right. I'm pleased with myself. They're married at 16. They have their first and only child at 29, a son named by his father Rahula, meaning fetter. Rahula is born on the day that Siddhartha leaves the palace, and there Yasadhara's story ends until Siddhartha returns as the Buddha. Yasadhara eventually becomes the Buddha's disciple as a nun of the order headed by the Buddha's aunt, Prajapati. Eventually, she achieves her own realization. Most stories say she achieves the status of Arhat in Theravada Buddhism, one who has escaped the wheel of birth and rebirth and will not be reborn. So this is the bare bones of her story as it has come to us, but there is hardly anything really known about her. There is virtually no reference to her in the earliest Pali canons. We don't hear her name until 500 years after her death. That's 20 generations. We don't even really know her name. We're calling her Yasadhara, but there are many names associated with what identified as wives of the Buddha. Bimba Devi, Bada Kachana, Rahula Mata, meaning mother of Rahula. Those are just a few. There's many names associated with the Buddha's wife. Some sources say that Siddhartha had more than one wife, others that there was one wife with various titles. While Yasadhara is said to have had one child, one of her alternate persona, Bada Kachana, is said to have had 10. Some stories have Rahula born on the day that Siddhartha leaves the palace, while others have Yasadhara pregnant for 6 years until he returns. Stories grow up around her as the centuries pass. A lot of there's stories about them falling in love, about their courtship, a lot of stories about how angry she is at him for leaving and also at his servant who helped him leave. There's stories about her many suitors. In some, she is reviled as an adulterer, in others, beloved as a chaste and faithful wife. In some stories, she learns of her husband's asceticism, and she parallels it with her own, starving herself and wearing rags. And there are stories about her behavior on his return. In some, she won't go to him. She refuses to go to him and sends Rahula instead. In others, he comes to her. And there are stories of her as an elder nun who remembers all of her innumerable past lives with him as a kind of superpower. So there's all these different conflicting versions of her life and stories about her. But in all of them, she is left. She grieves, she endures, and eventually she becomes enlightened. Yasadhara may or may not have been an historical figure, but it doesn't really matter. Like her husband, Yasadhara is an archetype, she who stays. He goes and becomes enlightened. She stays and also becomes enlightened. So what does it mean to stay? We don't have any documentation about her experience during his absence, but we can guess. Like a good Buddhist, I have made a list. And like many Buddhist lists, this one is awkwardly constructed and its items overlap. But there's a few themes and qualities that jump out at me when I imagine Yasadhara's experience and how it may have supported her eventual enlightenment. The first one that jumps out at me is the transformative power of grief. The hero's journey is initiated with a call to adventure. Yasadhara's journey is initiated by grief, that most authentic and transformative of emotions. I've seen the power of grief to transform often and experienced it myself, but that's another talk. For now, think of your own experiences with grief, the way it knocks you breathless, the way it forces authenticity on you, the way it brings us face to face with impermanence. Grief can be an express train to awakening if we have the courage to experience it deeply. Which brings us to the next quality I imagine in Yasadhara, courage. Staying requires courage and humility. Being left behind is a terrifying experience. People make all kinds of bad decisions to avoid being left behind. It's not at all uncommon for grievers to want to join their loved one who has died, and this alarms their friends and families, but it doesn't come from a place of depression or suicide the way we think of it. It comes from simply not wanting to be left and not wanting to be alone. I love survival stories, and I've read a lot of them. And in many of these stories, climbers who have reached their limit or run out of oxygen die because they would rather continue with the group than be left on the mountainside alone. There's a lot of examples of the fear of staying. Staying often means asking for help, and asking for help requires humility. So given the difficulty and the courage required to stay, why do we do it? It turns out we do it oftentimes for others. Staying is often altruistic. It's hard to stay. We know why Siddhartha went off on his adventure, but why did Yasadhara stay? I mean, except for that she probably wasn't invited. But why didn't she go off on her own adventure? Why didn't she run off with one of her many suitors? Why did she go on living, given the grief and anger she is said to have experienced? Well, she had a newborn baby. When things seem hopeless, we go on because of our kids, our parents, our friends, our pets. I wish I had a dime for every time I heard in grief group, I wouldn't bother to get out of bed in the morning, but I have to walk the dog. Or I would be happy to join him in heaven, but who would feed the cat? If you know the story of Scheherazade or Katniss Everdeen, you know that both of those heroic women stepped up, risking their own lives in place of their sisters. And I love this story. It is said that Margaret Mead was asked by a student what she considered to be the first sign of civilization in a culture. The student expected Mead to talk about fishhooks or clay pots or grinding stones, but instead, Mead said that the first sign of civilization in an ancient culture was a femur, a thigh bone, which had been broken and then healed. Mead explained that in the animal kingdom, if you break your leg, you die. You can't run from danger, you can't get to the river for a drink, you can't hunt for food. You are meat for prowling beasts. No animal survives a broken leg long enough for the bone to heal. So, a broken femur that has healed is evidence that someone risked their own life to stay behind with the one who fell, has bound the wound, has carried the person to safety, and has tended the person through recovery. The first sign of civilization is one who stayed. Then we have the value of commitment. The hero's journey is essentially a boy's tale. There's a different theme which shows up in fairy tales and myths involving girls and women, and it's known as the impossible task. A girl is given an impossible task by forces that are beyond her control. She completes the task by her wits and often with the help of animals, magical creatures, or fairy godmothers, emerging finally with unexpected rewards. Think of Cinderella, who has to clean the whole castle in one night. This resonates with me. The bird's helper and her fairy godmother. Think of the miller's daughter, tasked with spinning straw into gold. She is helped by an elf. Think of Yasadhara, left behind on the day her child is born. Think of all women in all countries of the world, bearing and raising children and maintaining civilization while their men are away making themselves the heroes of history. This is she who stays. Every single mom working on 2 or 3 part-time jobs with toddlers at home. She is more than the 16 million Americans, providing billions of hours of unpaid care for family members with Alzheimer's and related dementia. She is Kanzeon, patiently hearing the cries of the world. And she is us in Sesshin, or on our cushions at home, staying put in the face of all kinds of temptations, fears, pain, boredom, and grief. And finally, her story speaks to me of the convergence of staying and going. In the traditional hero's journey and in our Zen tradition, much is made of the home departure. In our lineage, home departure refers to the act of leaving one's secular life to embark on a spiritual journey in pursuit of awakening and a deeper understanding of the Dharma. But the Zen practitioner who leaves home for the monastery will inevitably find the monastery a boring, restrictive place where the other residents are at least as annoying as the practitioner's family used to be. And you can't tell me that there weren't at least a few moments during the 49 days the Bodhisattva sat under his tree that he didn't seriously contemplate getting up and going home. At this point, home departure becomes the practice of staying. This is from The Buddha's Wife, a lovely book by Janet Suri and Samuel Shem. They write, "The vow to stay is one made by ordinary people in their life journeys, relational vows to stay through illness, old age, and death. These are normal, but often private and hidden, vows of care and commitment that underlie our staying present in our closest relationships in life. They are usually not heralded or recorded in any public way, but frequently are steps on the path of awakening in relationship." So Yasadhara teaches us that staying calls for resilience in the face of loss, courage, humility, altruism, and fierce commitment, all qualities which loosen our attachment to self. She teaches us that her story and Siddhartha's story, although culturally gendered, are not at their roots a male story or a female story. After all, being born is a call to adventure regardless of gender. And because for everyone who leaves, there is someone who is left, concurrent with the call to adventure arises Yasadhara's story, the spiritual path of love, loss, courage, altruism, and commitment. The impossible task of she who stays is not glorious, famous, or flamboyant, or even noticed by anyone. You won't find it in the history books. It is often lonely, painful, depressing, and unacknowledged. Nevertheless, she persists. And like the hero's journey, her story contains elements that are universal and inspiring, and it ends in awakening. Dogen speaks to this in the Fukan Zazengi. Why leave behind the seed in your own home to wander the dusty realms of other lands? If you make one misstep, you miss what is directly in front of you. And from the lovely song of the Grass Roof Hermitage, turn around the light to shine within, then just return. The vast, inconceivable source can't be faced or turned away from. Meet the ancestral teachers, be familiar with their instruction, find grasses to build a hut, and don't give up. That's my talk. Questions and comments? And I have some if you guys don't. So.
That was beautiful. Thank you. Amazing.
Thank you.
That was beautiful. And I love the staying power of women. And my name is Penelope, who's the wife of Odysseus.
Yes.
Who stayed home and had lots and lots of suitors, but she just would weave all day long. And then she'd tear it out at night and start over again.
Mm-hmm.
And
I love Penelope's story.
Yeah.
I didn't realize you were named for her. Go your mom. Good.
I was named for Penelope, yes.
That's lovely. I love that. Yeah. She's a classic, she who stays.
Yeah, I was waiting for you to mention her name, but you didn't.
I had it, but my talk was like 3 hours long. I had to take a bunch of stuff out of it.
Well, that gave me the chance to
That's true.
say it. So thank you for not mentioning it.
That was awesome, Teiko. I just have so many thoughts going in my head. It was very, very excellently done and thought-provoking, and yeah, but really, really nice. Thank you so much. What a great gift.
Thank you, Trish. What were some of the thoughts that you had?
Oh, just about grief and loss and commitment, and about how, a lot. That you want to just seek things, but sometimes staying is harder, but more rewarding in ways that you never thought about.
Yeah.
And the loyalty of her to her child, and the pain she must have suffered, but the joy that she had her child, and not knowing what was going to happen. Just all the emotions that she must have been feeling at different times, and not really being able to have the question answered of why, but then getting enlightened herself, staying. That's amazing.
I kind of feel compelled to say that, and we all know this, but like, there are times to not stay. I just need to say that. There are times when it's better not to stay, and I think that's where wisdom comes in, that discrimination.
Yeah.
There's a freedom that comes with being left behind. And we don't talk about that very much, but if I got your story right, they were married at 16 and didn't have the child till 29. So they had 13 years together, and she was probably the good wife and all of that. And then he was gone. And from my own experience, there's a grieving, but there's a freedom there too.
I love that, Nancy. I didn't think of that. Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. it made me think about times in my life when I've stayed that were difficult, really difficult, and where there was something important on the other side of that, some growth on the other side of that. Can you think of times in your lives?
Yeah, went back to school and got a master's degree.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Well, you had mentioned, I think one of the things you mentioned was staying in the midst of a session. And yeah, I think I mean, there's always that point in session where it's just like, oh, and there's been, there's so much juice on the other side of that moment.
Yeah.
And that even replays in every session of Zazen, during different phases of practice, where sometimes it's easy and sometimes it's really not. And to me, that I still tend to cycle through that. So I find that oftentimes that's where the wisdom is, and that's where the real insight eventually comes, even if it feels like I'm not doing anything other than just waiting for the timer to go off. So there's yeah. And I remember early on, Kyogen and others saying, like, that's oftentimes the most important time. That's it, is when you really feel like it's not going anywhere, you're not doing anything, your mind's really busy, you're just wanting to be done, but that great resolve. And even as I'm talking, I'm like, it's helpful to remind myself of that because it's because yeah, sometimes you can really believe that voice that says, oh, this isn't really doing anything.
Oh yeah, no, that's the same voice that says, oh, you can have a drink. You couldn't possibly be an alcoholic. That's the same voice.
Yeah, that unwise part of us, but there's that wisdom part of us that really knows.
Well, I feel like with me, that's really my ego. That's that voice, because it doesn't want to die. It doesn't want to go away, and it's threatened by Zazen and Sesshin.
I think there's something really powerful about getting through Zazen when you have that voice, or even like I've been having hip pain when I sit, for like, that's just been a thing for this past year. And so I've been like not forcing myself to be in like a lot of pain, but just if it hurts a little bit, I'll just kind of sit through it. And I just feel like there's something that kind of powerful in doing that, and not sort of giving into every little tiny thing. I mean, I think it's, I don't know, it's good for your brain, I think.
Yeah, every time that happens, which is for me, during Zazen, about every 5 minutes, that's where the work is, I think. And pain, sitting through pain. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was thinking too of Buddha's wife, whose name I just spaced out on, that she had a child. And, and I was thinking, when my husband left, I had 2 children, and, I couldn't really go anywhere. I had to stay and work, but then I spent the summer with them and went places with them. But I was the one that had the children. And even though my ex-husband didn't go off doing the hero's journey, he had a new relationship, and we all know what fun it is to have a new relationship. And but so there was something to staying. And I also like when you're talking about Zazen and sitting, because sometimes it's very difficult for me to just sit. My legs start twitching. I think they want to walk.
Well, especially for you, Penny. It must be 10 times as hard for you as it is for us.
Well, I
just-
don't know about that. It
Well,
sounds like Monica talking about
Yeah.
pain. I mean, you know, it's hard to sit for a long period of time.
it is hard to sit. You know, and I think about how, you know, when Siddhartha left the palace and he's just on this kind of glorious quest, but eventually he sits down and he vows not to move, and I think that would have been really, really hard. But she already knew that. You know, she already knew she had to stay put.
That's
the part that I noticed. You drew both of them together as not leaving. She not leaving, he not leaving the tree. I thought that was impressive.
Well, I mean, to me, it turned out that leaving, going, it's the same. Staying, leaving. I mean, I guess it's possible to keep leaving forever, and there are people that do that, I think, in their lives with relationships, you know, that never mature in relationships. So, yeah.
I'm kind of thinking about so I've always been bothered by Buddha, by by him leaving his wife also. That's always been a really hard part of the story for me as well. And but I'm kind of thinking now after your talk here, the part of the Buddha story that's my favorite part is when he goes through this whole process of starving himself almost to death and doing all these things, and then realizing that that's wrong. I mean, it's I don't know, like he goes through all that and he realizes that's the wrong way, and that he wants to have somebody offers him rice or something like that, and he decides to eat and just kind of realizes that I didn't have to really go through all of that. Kind of, you know what I mean? Like that little part of it, that moment is like my favorite part of the story.
The middle way, me too.
Yeah. And I almost feel like that moment is kind of like he eventually comes home again, you know, like he just, after, I mean, all of his questing, he does end up going back home, which I also think is important. I don't know. He kind of goes through all of that and then realizes the same thing that his wife realizes. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm
Yeah.
still trying to work it out, but I
Yeah.
think it's really an interesting, really super interesting thing to think about.
How long was he gone?
6 years.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
Yeah.
What I got out of it was how the female's journey is all about asking for help. It may be about staying, but it's all about asking for help.
Mhm.
And what you guys are all saying about zazen and sitting through the pain, yeah, you're not wrong. But what I got out of that, trying to sit through the pain at sesshin, was that it wasn't until I asked for help that it became endurable pain and not absolute torture.
Yeah, thanks for picking up on that, Dixie. You know, I could have written a lot more about that, but like I said, it's already 3 hours long, so I had to cut some stuff. But I think that asking for help is huge, and that came up a lot in grief groups too. You know, it's so hard, and I don't know if that's an American culture thing or if it's just Western. I don't know, but anyway, it's really hard for us to ask for help, and it's such a gift to the people that you ask it of. Yeah. That's another talk. You should do that one, Dixie.
Take
Teiko, I'm curious, how was it for you putting this stuff together?
Well, thank you for asking. It was wild. It was, I mean, because I worked on it for such a long time that, and I just learned so much stuff and got lost in the weeds so many times. Really, Shintai was so helpful, and I did not receive her help graciously all the time either, but it was very helpful. To focus, because I mean, so putting the talk together was a wonderful adventure for me. I enjoyed it, but I worked on it a little. Yeah, I got a little too obsessive about it, and then kind of like got to the point. You know how when you repeat a word over and over again, and then you can't make any sense out of it. It got like that. And it got like, I don't even know what this is about anymore. So it's a good thing. It's a good thing that I had Shintai, and also that I got to finally share the story.
It would be interesting to hear the son's side of it. If he was only 6 when his father returned, I mean, that's still pretty young. But he's already past the formative, whatever that is, the formative years. But I think I had read that he also became a follower, a monk, or whatever.
Well, and I mean, some of the early stories have him not born until he comes back as the Buddha. Oh. She's pregnant for 6 years. Talk about the impossible task. Who knows? You know, magical times. And that was another thing I really enjoyed about putting the talk together, is because there's a lot of sort of magical realism in it, which is one of my favorite genres.
Yeah, you brought a lot of yourself and your previous studies over the years. You brought a lot to it. It showed. And it was well written.
You didn't mention any virgin birth in this.
Well, no, it was more like the opposite, like the extended pregnancy.
Uh-huh.
And I'm not sure what that was about. We just don't know.
I wonder, like, this is my literature student hat here on, but I wonder if like the extended pregnancy has to do with sort of the patriarchal nature of the story of Buddha leaving home, and then he comes back and he doesn't have to suffer the consequence. You know, he doesn't have to really suffer the consequences of leaving his newborn child, because when he comes back, his child is, you know what I mean? I don't know. Just,
interesting.
Because there is like a lot of layers. I mean, throughout history, there's a lot of layers of retelling the stories. And I mean, it was patriarchal societies who were retelling these stories. And
totally. That's a really interesting thought. I mean, we just, it's like there really is. I mean, and I did kind of want to emphasize that we, at least me, and with my Western mind, I want to know the facts. What happened? You know, when, who, what, where? You know, like a news story. We don't know. They're archetypes. Maybe they were real. Maybe they weren't. It doesn't matter.
But I do love I mean, I think, you know, I mean, if you look at facts, you can assume she was probably pregnant for 9 months, because we're human beings and we don't stay pregnant for 6 years, you know. And I like the idea of her, just this whole story of her staying and taking care of her child is such a real, that's a real story. I mean, that's like the story of women, you know, throughout history. Like that's what women do. I mean, maybe they don't necessarily want to have a child, but they have a child and they have to take care of it, because what else are you going to do? You can't like not take care of your baby, you know. That's what you do. So
that's what you do. Yeah, and her story was like Penelope's, and in a lot of the stories about her, her father-in-law, the Buddhist dad, is mad at her for because she has all these, men that are supposedly courting her, and that makes him angry, and claims that the child isn't his grandson, and she isn't redeemed until he comes back and claims the child as his son. I mean, that's just one of 100 stories about her, but you know how it goes when you're a single mom. Thanks for listening, you guys. That was fun.
Thank you, Emily.
That was really good. Thank you.
That was really good. And it brings up all kinds of things like, Zazen and Sasheen and being a single mom and,
Yeah.
and being the one that stays
behind.
and waits.
Yeah. Well, and it helps me in some ways too. I mean, there have been times when I'm like, I've wasted my life. I should have joined the monastery. So it's helpful to think of that.
It's kind of the one who stays behind and chops the wood and carries the water, as opposed to going out and finding the new adventures,
Slaying the dragon.
Slaying the dragon.
Coming home all covered with blood with the dragon's head.
Well, it's clear you put a lot of time and energy into it, and it was very well put together. And
thank you.
I'm somebody who feels like when you talk about communication in this day and age, and then you've got words and other things like that. And I struggle with facts and I struggle with stories because I love stories, but who knows what the facts really are and the story really is. So you have to, for me, I take away the try and find the key messages, like you brought out, because I don't really know the story. You pass it down through generations and different people, and who knows what part of it is real and what's real anyway, so
exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's why it doesn't really matter. And I only told you the parts that resonated with me, but as you read the Buddha story and as you think about Yasadhara's story, different things will, like, I didn't think of what Nancy said about the feeling of freedom after a death or a loss, and I didn't emphasize Dixie's point about asking for help. So you think of your own parts that are meaningful.
Yeah.
Well, I loved that you had to ask for help, Emily, to finish this, to do this.
It's required, or else I wouldn't have, and it would have been a much worse talk. No, I
but
probably
asking
would've.
for help is a big thing.
Yeah, it's hard.
It's hard. I know.
It is.
I know that because I have trouble with that.
We should practice that, because at some point, you're going to have to ask for help. So, might as well practice.
Right.
We're all getting older. Yes.
Yes.
I'm getting younger.
Except for Trish, she's getting younger.
I wish.
Could somebody do a closing verse, please?
I was just going to ask you if you were going to do the closing verse.
No, I'm tired of my voice. Tired of my voice.
Happy to do the closing verse.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking the time to prepare and offer the talk. Very much appreciated. Thank you very much.